Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast.
Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to another exciting episode. You're joining me inside the MR2025 Mobility, Adaptation, and Wellbeing in a Changing Climate Conference at Columbia University in New York City. It was a fantastic event and part of an ongoing series where some of the most difficult and necessary conversations in climate adaptation are taking place. In this episode, we'll hear from conference organizers, attendees, and some of the leading thinkers of managed relocation. The experts in this episode explore what it means to move people and communities in the face of escalating climate risks, not just along the coast, but wherever staying put is no longer safe. This isn't just about logistics. It's about justice, dignity, and the right to choose a safer future. You'll hear people talk about the pool of place, the politics that make retreat so tricky, the hard financial realities behind it all, and how storytelling helps make these issues feel real and human. And we'll also hear from the former president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, who issued a powerful call for leadership, imagination, and global responsibility in the face of climate change. Whether you're deep in the world of adaptation or just learning what managed retreat even means, this episode brings together voices you need to hear. This episode was generously sponsored by Tulane University Center on Climate Change and Urbanism. Thanks again for their support. Okay, let's get into it. Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Alex Dashurbinen. Alex is the chair of the MR2025 Organizing Committee and director and senior research scientist at the Center for Integrated Earth System Information at Columbia Climate School. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Doug.
Thanks for coming on. And first off, we're having this interview after the event. Congratulations. What a world-class event. I learned a ton, and I brought you on because I want to ground us. So just more broadly, what is MR 2025?
It's the fourth in a series of conferences that used to be called Managed Retreat. It came out of something called the Adaptation Initiative at Climate School. Previously, actually, prior to the Climate School, was the Earth Institute. And so we had this adaptation initiative, and another colleague and I, Radley Horton, came up with the idea of doing a series of at least one conference on managed retreat. That first conference in 2019 was so successful that we quickly realized that it had hit the right note. It covered the right material. We were addressing a lot of environmental justice, climate justice, and other topics that were resonating with our community. Also just addressing a range of practical matters related to how do you organize a community to relocate where they may be in danger of, say, storm surge, flooding, wildfire risk, that kind of thing. And also how do federal agencies, state agencies address topics such as buyouts and insurance rates, and how are we going to address this impending insurance crisis where fewer and fewer people may be either able to afford insurance or simply insurers retreat from the market. So we felt that that first conference really gave us an indication that this was a community that was ready for a regular series of convenings. So we went ahead and organized the 2021 conference entirely online during COVID. And then in 2023, we made it a hybrid conference with the ability for remote participation. And we started opening up the conference more to international topics around climate mobility, the topics that range from refugee type situations, humanitarian situations, where people are being displaced in part because of climate pressures and climate stressors, to involuntary immobility, where people get trapped in locations and they simply can't move because they're too poor to move, and even more voluntary types of migration, where people are moving in part because climate pressures are making their surroundings less desirable. This year, we leaned more fully and heavily into a range of topics that go well beyond managed retreat. So we decided to relabel the conference MR 2025, where MR could stand for managed retreat, but it also could stand for mobility and resilience, which is the broader umbrella which we're looking for.
Just stepping back a bit, this is an area of research for you. How did you get drawn into this area of managed retreat, I guess, individually in your own professional take?
That's a great question. So starting really back in 2007 or so, I was approached by a UN agency called the UN Population Division, and they asked me to write a paper on what future population distribution might look like under climate change. And I just found it a fascinating thought experiment and was already familiar with some of the maps of future climate projections, where areas might get hotter, drier, or maybe subject to more intense rainfall. And I was also very familiar with maps showing the population distribution of the world because our center, the Center for Integrated Earth System Information, is one of the foremost developers of population distribution map. I was really interested in imagining what future population distributions might look like. So that was my first foray into this. Then quickly thereafter, we had some collaborations with Coco Warner, who's one of the leading thinkers on climate migration. She at that time was at the UN University in Bonn. And she came to me and said, we'd love to do a kind of policy-oriented booklet that describes case studies that have been done around the world through a certain research funding organization in Europe. And we want to pair those with maps. So I was able to put together some really nice maps with a team of people at Season. That's what we call our center. And we produced those maps. It became a report called In Search of Shelter, which is also still widely cited. And then a great opportunity arose to work with the World Bank, and we produced a whole report series called Groundswell, where we looked at future projections of climate migration. But to do that, we first had to project future population distribution. So that brings me full circle.
One of your keynote speakers was a former president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado. So why did you invite him to speak?
So we had two connections, actually. One is through Jesse Keenan. Jesse has been one of the foremost thinkers in this space. And I just have incredible admiration for his work and for his thoughtfulness in this area. And so we've been collaborating since the first Managed Retreat Conference. And he suggested President Alvarez, and I agreed. But it also happened that one of our co-sponsors for the conference, the Global Center for Climate Mobility, tapped President Alvarez to be the chair of their advisory committee. And they also recently completed something that we participated in was a Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, where we did future projections of climate mobility in the Caribbean region and also looked at a series of case studies and interviews on the ground with communities that are being impacted. President Alvarez just turned out to be a natural choice. He was a great keynote speaker. He brought, I think, what is a much needed dimension to the conference, which is what do policymakers actually need? And I'll just add that Costa Rica has been an excellent example of what can be done when you have the right policy alignment. As a country, the U.S. could learn much from Costa Rica right now.
It was a treat for me. I'd lived in Costa Rica and been there many times, and I told the president so just on interviewing the former president of Costa Rica, and it was just a thrill. And my listeners, he's coming up soon. Let's pivot a little bit here, and you aren't able to attend everything, but what were some of the topics or presentations that stood out for you? There was some really interesting work going on.
One topic that we're hearing more about is how the commercial insurers are pulling out of certain markets, say California, Florida. So these are the large multi-state, you think Allstate, think of Farmers, but you can imagine the home insurers that people are using, and they're diversified in ways that enable them to absorb impacts, say in one market, let's say California versus something that might lower risks in a place like Maine or Massachusetts. But what's happening is they're simply saying we're not going to issue any new policies in places like California. And again, I don't want to single out individual insurers. What's important to realize is actually what they're doing is they're trying to shed their risk. And at first I said, this is natural and normal. Like this is actually telling California that you shouldn't be building in the wildland urban interface in these places with really high fire risk, or telling Florida homeowners, this is really a bad idea to be living near the coastal zone in a high hurricane risk area. But I thought the most compelling element of one session I attended was really underscoring how actually they're cherry picking the highest and most lucrative opportunities and essentially shedding risk and basically saying, we're not going to insure here, but we're going to let the state insurers, which are the insurers of last resort, the ones that have the lowest coverage, the ones that are not really going to cover all of your costs when a disaster strikes, we're going to let them pick up the bill in those areas. And it makes sense. Pooling risk is the fundamental element under insurance. And if you've essentially shed those areas, you are increasing your profits, you're reducing your exposure. but you're doing it in such a way that may not be certainly not very beneficial to the American public. And so that was one session that hit a really important note for me. There was another session where a gentleman presented on future scenarios. So I work in the space that looks a lot at future scenarios of climate impacts and hazards and the way it intersects with society. And there's something called the shared socioeconomic pathways, which looks at the future along 5 different scenarios that essentially say, what might America look like in a world with, say, higher emissions where everyone's emitting very heavily, but we're more affluent because we're emitting, and therefore we can do more in terms of adaptation. Whereas what might America look like in a more sustainable scenario where emissions are low, but we also have really good adaptation investments? And what might America look like in a world where emissions are actually lower, but our adaptive capacity is also impaired? So there are these in where the world is much more fragmented and where there's the wealthy and the poor and the kind of walls are going up between countries. Trade is impaired. There's much less trade. We might already be entering into that kind of future world right now. And so those shared socioeconomic pathways are extremely valuable. But what this gentleman from Colorado State University, what he said was, actually, we need more than that. We need more narratives that talk about low probability, but very high consequence scenarios in the future where black swan events might occur. And then we also need to talk about what is the space that's the most desirable? Where do we want to head as a society? And the interesting thing, the SSPs are a really wonderful framework, but they're agnostic about which future is actually the most desirable. But I think we all carry in us basically a sense that we want to avoid those worst case, really maybe far flung, but imagine a scenario where basically the water sources in the entire southwestern U.S. dry up and shipping water is prohibitively costly and we don't really have the means economically to do it anymore like we did back in the day when we were building huge dams and canals and moving water all over the place. So what would that future look like for the Southwest U.S.? What would a future with just every year you have devastating wildfires look for the Pacific Northwest? And these need to be taken into consideration. So those were 2 areas that I thought were interesting in terms of the sessions I attended.
We hear that the word retreat, and I know you guys changed the title because you didn't want managed retreat necessarily to be sticking out, but it can be potentially toxic. And do you think the field is doing enough to change the narrative, or is it still stuck in academic and planning circles? Because there was a lot of academics at this conference, but what do you think? Do you think it's penetrating outside the academic circles?
I totally agree. And that's one recurring theme of the Managed Retreat conference series is that when communities hear the word managed retreat, their hackles get up because immediately there's a lot of distrust in government. What has government done for me recently? How do we trust that these institutions are going to serve us well? But secondly, retreat has a negative connotation in the U.S. context. I've heard other terms that I think are poor substitutes in some ways for the concept. But I think once we talk about mobility more broadly, we're talking about moving. People have always been mobile in the U.S. They move regularly. We're one of the most highly mobile societies in the world. And I think it opens up new possibilities for spinning the narrative in a slightly more positive directions where you say, well, moving out of this area that's high risk is potentially a win-win for you. You get to relocate to an area that's safer, but in all probability, not terribly far away. Most people who do move from, say, the immediate coastal zone typically just move under 50 kilometers or let's say 30 miles inland. This is respinning, and maybe we need more recommendations and more help from people like you, Doug, who are active in the space of communication. How do we actually communicate this in a way that people are not immediately resistant to the idea, but see the possibilities instead?
All right, I'll submit a panel idea at the next one. Okay, you've inspired me to do that. Just so as we wrap this up, what's next for the conference? What are you guys thinking?
We would like to host MR2027. There's no question that's high on our priority list. And I think the communications team at the climate school really captured the energy and saw how vital a role we're playing in convening in this space. So we would definitely plan on another conference. And it's just, at this point, I think we're just breathing a sigh of relief and celebrating the fact that this last one went off so well. So that's where things stand.
Once again, it was a great event and great facilities, and enjoy just roaming around there. Thanks for having me there, Alex.
Thank you, Doug. We appreciated your attendance.
Hey, Adapters, I'm here, and I'm with
Hannah Teicher.
Where are you at, and what do you do?
I'm at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where I'm an assistant professor of urban planning.
I saw you gave a presentation, so let's talk a little bit about that. What is a climate haven?
Good question. So climate haven is a pretty contested concept. It's gotten a lot of media coverage so far, where there are certain cities like Buffalo and Duluth that have gotten a lot of attention, saying these cities are going to be safer under climate change and basically Americans should move here. But it's also a really problematic concept because everywhere is going to be really impacted by climate change, and most places are really unprepared. So there's just been a lot of argument about whether we should even designate any place a climate haven.
And I've thought about actually doing an episode on Asheville, North Carolina as a potential climate haven, but something happened to it. So what was that?
Yeah, there was a really big flood in Asheville when Hurricane Helene came through. And so that really put the climate haven notion to rest. But I'd like to suggest that even if we don't want to think about climate havens in this idealized sense, there are still going to be receiving communities, places that will receive climate migrants who either were forcibly displaced or chose to move. And so we should be planning for that, but we need to plan for it in an integrated way that takes adaptation seriously. We can't just assume that places are going to be safe because of their physical conditions.
You make the point that no place is probably completely safe, but we are going to be living in a world where we'll need places that are safer. So you're going to have to make those adjustments. And so you had a map that listed where people would be safest. And I guess I lost track. Was that your work or was that someone else's work that sort of said these Midwest states, or could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. What we were doing, and I'm working with a few collaborators on this project, Katie McConnell and Carol Vulgaris, we noticed that there's been a lot of attention to the Great Lakes region. And so we decided to talk about it as an imagined receiving zone. There's nothing that does make it necessarily inherently safer. It's just the place that people are talking about. And so we took that as a point of departure. And then on top of that, we looked at the socioeconomic conditions in that region and the adaptation capacity to say, are these places that actually have the capacity to receive people and are currently receiving people?
What is a receiving community? You alluded to it already, but it's a technical definition, right?
I'm not sure that there's really a precise technical definition. A receiving community for climate migrants is a place that's receiving climate migrants, but that's still not very well understood. Climate migration, especially internally, is not that well counted. And so we already do have people who are displaced from natural disasters. We have people that are proactively choosing to move, and they may be moving to any of these destinations. So we can understand receiving communities as places that already are receiving people, but they're also places that are trying to position themselves to receive people. There are certain depopulating cities that see this as a real economic development opportunity. So that goes back to the Buffalos and the Duluths. And there are others that are now trying to jump on that bandwagon.
Are you seeing, and we're at a managed retreat conference where a lot of academics are putting a lot of thought into this. And so I think it's a big fantasy world if we think it's going to be as managed as we'd liked it to be. It'd be nice if it would be, right? If the federal government and the state governments just had this integrated approach. But we hopefully will get to a point where we're going to develop metrics for areas. This is at least a safer, better area to migrate to.
But I think one of my real points is that what will make a place safer and better is a lot of planning and a lot of building infrastructure and a lot of adaptation. So we should consider the physical qualities, temperature and water access, drought, things like that. But beyond that, we really need to take the socioeconomic conditions and the adaptation seriously.
Are there any lessons to be learned at some of the other great American migrations like the Dust Bowl and then the Rust Belt migration? I think a lot of that might just be hyperbole, but there are probably some lessons to be learned that, and think of, I guess, on the receiving end of all that.
Absolutely. It's really essential to put this into historical context and to avoid saying that climate is something new and we've never seen this before. There have been a huge number of migrations in human history and environmental migration, like the ones that you've pointed to. And so there is a lot to learn from that, but I think also we can learn from other contemporary forms of migration, and I've done that in some of my previous work. So look at how can cities be welcoming to immigrants? There's a whole movement around that, and that movement is starting to mesh with movement around climate migration because it's clear that there are a lot of lessons to be learned. There are also a lot of cities and towns that have experience receiving amenity migrants, so people who have come for outdoor lifestyles. And we saw a huge uptick in this with COVID, an increase in remote work. And so there's a lot to learn out there, and we should definitely understand that this is not new. One of the main points is really taking seriously the impacts on existing residents and the risk of gentrification and displacement when you have newcomers coming in, especially if they're newcomers with more money. So we really need to plan for places and events where those people can come into contact with each other and learn how to accommodate each other and live together.
As you're saying that, it just occurred to me. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I grew up in Florida. So this whole notion of the snowbird, I've lived with it forever, and I don't actually like it. But here's a situation where they're actually trying to attract these people to come here. I'm wondering if there's lessons to be learned there where it is a little bit more structured and there's not that urgency, but there's, I guess, incentives to get people to move.
Yeah, I think there are. There's a really interesting counterpoint in looking at the move to the Sun Belt and thinking about how we might start to see a move northward back to the Frost Belt. And interestingly, I've been looking at this as a counterpoint because we still see so much migration to the Sun Belt, to Texas and Arizona, and those are places that are water stressed. But interestingly, in earlier days when they were trying to attract people, some of these places actually emphasized the water that they had. And so now we see that kind of working in reverse, where Great Lakes states are trying to, in some way, sell their water access. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I hope if we're a bit more strategic and we do that adaptation planning, part of the problem with snowbirds is that there's less commitment to invest in social services and education in those areas. And so if you are attracting people because of climate change, you need to plan those things out. That's a little me being on a soapbox dealing with snowbirds all my life. Okay, you had mentioned outside of this conversation something called corporate migration. What is that?
So that's an area that I'm starting to look into that I think is going to be really important as corporations start to take climate risk seriously in their location and investment decision making. I think we're going to see corporations moving away from climate risk. At this point, it's very incipient. So if you look at it on a large scale, it's really undetectable. But anecdotally, it's starting to bubble to the surface. And it's especially true for businesses that are making really large, multi-billion-dollar long-term investments like in semiconductor fabs. So they need to think about where they're going to have water access or reliable grid access over the long term. So this is something that I've just been starting to look at, looking at how economic development organizations may be trying to sell their locations as climate havens and try to attract business that way, and then how businesses are starting to respond.
Okay, so you're a professor at Harvard. Are you taking students on to do research related to what you're doing?
We take a good-sized cohort of master's students every year. And so mostly I work with master's students, and a lot of them are doing research for me. So I'm always happy to talk to students.
All right, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Hey, Adapters, I'm back, and I'm doing something for the first time. I'm interviewing a president of a country, and a country I know very well, and that's Costa Rica. Joining me is President Alvarado. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure for me. I have long-standing ties to Costa Rica, and so this is a real treat. But you're here at the Managed Retreat Conference, and you gave the keynote address. Very inspiring, very interesting. Can you give us some highlights of what you covered?
My intention was to share some of my own lessons from being in office and before into how sometimes we approach things with our best approach from reality, from science, but sometimes we have blind spots. We have blind spots on that. And I think that was the case. I used the example of Costa Rican decarbonization case, which is, let's say, a decarbonization plan that's the best in class it was when it was launched. But looking back, I even questioned the name itself, the Decarbonization National Plan, because at the end of the day, it was not about decarbonization. It was about changing the livelihoods, positively changing and impacting livelihoods of the people of Costa Rica, both in climate, but in their incomes, in the health of the country. So that's a little bit what I came to talk here, is to question our assumptions of from where our knowledge comes from and how to do that when engaging, especially with communities or vulnerable communities that are subject to a phenomenon of adaptation, of climate migration. How to be mindful of that might improve the way we engage.
So you've been a leader on climate change. Costa Rica has been a leader on it. How do the people of Costa Rica actually think about climate change, though? Sometimes leaders are kind of leading and you're having to pull the people behind. Are they supportive of these efforts?
For most, yeah, Costa Rica's got a tradition of, for example, ever since we created national park system last century, started in the 70s, in the early 70s, also moving forward with forestry plans like the payment for environmental services, which is paying to private forest owners to protect it. So we have grown with a reputation, but that reputation is embedded on reality. Also because people have seen the benefits. One of our main industries is ecotourism, which is a clean industry that provides jobs for people across the country. So for most, we have not only the reputation, but it's embedded in our citizenship, that trait of environmentalism. That being said, it's also relevant to not take that for granted and to keep pushing forward, but demonstrating how that false division between humans and the environment is not the case, is that we're in this together. And also in the case of Costa Rica, sometimes we want to go a little bit beyond, like push for more avant-garde. You always have to explain and make that effort to I call it to connect the dots back to the household. Why this sophisticated policy or this avant-garde policy, it's good for you and for your future and for your children. So that exercise of connecting the dots back to the household is something that I also stress today in the remarks.
Also joining me today is Jesse Keenan. Jesse Keenan, a regular contributor to America Adapts. Jesse, I'm going to put you on the spot and let you ask the president a question.
Yeah, I think one thing, first of all, thank you for the keynote. It was, I think, an emotional charge for people in the audience, and not just a moment of inspiration, but a moment of reflection of where we stand and where we have to go. One of the things that I've taken from your work and from your speech today was decarbonization is a multi-sectoral plan. And I think in adaptation, we struggle with the multi-sectoral aspects to connect the dots. I'm curious your thoughts on what do you think it's going to take, or what lessons would you offer to us to pull in all of these various sectors? Because I think a lot of times in adaptation or human mobility, we think housing, infrastructure, moving person from A to B, whatever that may be. We think in very material terms. We don't think about the broad notion of livelihood or connection to place or environmental management. What can we learn from your experience in this multi-sectoral process of driving climate action?
First, Jesse, thanks for those words. One is, you mentioned emotion, and I stress that a lot because our training, professional training in universities or, at politics or jobs, sometimes we stress a lot on the rational part of us being. You need to be rational. You need to think about this. You need to measure. You need to have conclusions. But we're human beings, and being human, it's rational, yes, but it's more than that. Our more emotion, let's call it another way of thinking about things. It's feeling about things. And I think our current societies, we tend to sometimes underestimate that. When our body feels, it's because we are responding to something in life. And I think sometimes we are trying to turn that off. You say, don't be emotional. Think this through. And I think we have to listen both to our reason, but to our emotions when we engage on this, and to go more fully into situations. This connected to your second question on adaptation. I think it's good to have those frameworks, those charts to try to prepare ourselves to when we do the work on the ground. The other good thing for preparedness is to be ready for those things that are not in the charts we already work in. That's a good thing, to be open to create knowledge there and with the people with the people, with the communities. One thing I've learned working, for example, in the Pacific Islands, and this is, again, a testament of our own ignorance, which is good. It means we are learning. I was so impressed the amount of time and interest they started to devote, for example, on heritage, on ancestry, on legacy. You say, but at first you're so fixed in climate mobility, you're thinking about migration, housing, sea level rise. But when you start to approach from that direction, you start to listen conversations like, all my ancestors are buried in this land, and what will happen if we go? And what will happen if the sea level rise takes away the sacred places, and not only for burial, but the sacred places? And then you start to realize that this is central in this community of how they see the world and they see themselves in the world. Sometimes we take for granted that our world vision is the world vision. So being open to that, what I like also about the adaptation in the case of climate mobility is a great example of the role of knowledge is to empower others, but the agency resides on, you're not going places telling you need to move and this is what you're going to do. No, you go in and saying, this is what we're seeing might happen. We're offering this for you. Now you can have a conversation. If we are invited to the conversation, great. We will also like to help, but basically you are empowering and enabling others. And I believe that's also a great way to start an adaptation journey.
I was actually a school teacher in San Pedro, Costa Rica, and my students, we always talked about soccer. And the only two teams that they liked were La Liga and Saprissa. And I used to joke with them that I liked Limon. And they used to get mad at me. So I'm going to ask you, then I'm going to ask your son, who's your favorite soccer team in Costa Rica?
Cartago.
All right. What's your favorite soccer team?
La Liga.
Okay. All right. And final question. Spent a lot of time in Costa Rica. And what's your favorite spot to go? If someone's a tourist and coming down there.
Oh, my favorite spot. For a tourist?
Or just your favorite
spot? Well, my favorite spot, it's on the yard with my parents. And I think it's that because I grew up there. But also when I go back, it's like we either have a coffee or a drink and we chat and we see the afternoon and a tree. So it's home. But if I were to give advice to people going there, there's plenty because you can literally wake up in the sunrise in Limon, take your car, cross the mountains, you'll see mountains, it will get a little bit chilly, you'll be in San Jose, and if you keep driving, you can see the sunset on the Pacific. And it's a completely different landscape, the Atlantic from the Pacific. The biodiversity is huge, and you can see either the beaches or the volcanoes or 6% of the world biodiversity there. If you're a bird watcher or you like it, that's the place to go.
I'm going to encourage my listeners not to bother your parents if they come down to Costa Rica. And my favorite place, I thought it was such a coincidence, your final slide was Volcan Arenal. And I've been there many times and I've hiked all over that place. It's a lovely place. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Pura vida.
Pura vida, and thanks for having me.
I'm back and I'm with
Loïc Leroy.
Who are you with and what are you studying?
I'm a PhD student from France. I'm based in Paris at the Sorbonne University, and I'm working on coastal adaptation by managed retreat and focused especially on urban planning issues.
So you're working in several different countries. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to compare different approaches to managed retreat in New Zealand, in France, and in the US, in the East Coast especially.
Let's dig into that a little bit. New Zealand, France, the US, are they fundamentally different in how they approach an issue like managed retreat?
In fact, even if they are Occidental cultures, they have different approaches because they are thinking not in the same way. They're planning their economic development. They have different issues. Natural environments are not the same, natural resources, and they have impacts linked to climate change that are absolutely not the same, with different climate, different storms, different impacts, and obviously different responses to all these hazards, all these risks.
You are in the business of working and developing tools to think about this too, right?
Yeah, it's I'm trying to find if there are good or bad practices linked to urban planning. So I'm focused on zoning, comprehensive planning, and local urban documents. So I'm trying to find if there are maybe measures linked to zoning that could help to move people away of high-risk areas by maybe incentives or any regulations that could help to facilitate retreat in a long-term dynamic to avoid any risks or any future risks for people, for assets, for economy in general. Yeah, it's a long-term analysis and a long-term vision of what our documents can just bring to us.
In France, you're obviously part of the European Union. Is managed retreat looked at from a country level, or are you integrating what you're thinking about, or other governments working with France to think about managed retreat?
For now, I'm not focused on a European scale, so I don't know much about other countries here. I know that in Italy or in the UK, there are some approaches that are completely different from the French one. And in France, we have some laws, some measures that have been implemented or not implemented, but adopted in the last few years. In 21, we had a law, climate resilience law, that just brings us new tools, new measures to help retreat. But they are still in an early process, so we don't have results for now.
We're here at this managed retreat conference. Any highlights for you?
Yeah, there's a lot to learn about. Honestly, there's really good sessions, really good workshops that we can just bring on the table and learn about that. We've learned about Hawaii strategies that are really linked to New Zealand strategies that I can see. So yeah, I've seen Hawaii, Florida, Louisiana, a lot of things that we can learn from, especially in France.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Olga Loganova. Olga is a journalist and documentary filmmaker. Hi, Olga. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Sure. We're recording this after the conference, but I got to meet you there, and I thought it was just very interesting. We have this documentary filmmaker here at this managed retreat conference, and so I wanted to bring you on and have a bit of a conversation. So maybe you could ground my listeners, give us some of your background and what brought you to this conference.
That's a great question, and I must say that I wear many hats, and at the conference, I was more in the capacity of a podcast producer and environmental journalist. This has been my third conference, Managed Retreat conference. Also, I need to say that this year it was not called Managed Retreat for obvious reasons. I think we're living in an environment where anything connected to climate change and environmental issues are rather in flux. Let's put it this way. So, I have been a journalist all my working career, and visual journalist, broadcast journalist, and a documentary filmmaker as well. And for the last few years, I've specifically concentrated on topics of managed retreat and climate displacement, climate resettlement or relocation, depending on the community. I have just released a 3-part narrative investigative podcast series about the first federally funded climate change fueled community resettlement in the US. It's the resettlement of an entire island in Louisiana. And the name of the podcast, if I can drop it, is Leaving the Island. So we just released it on public radio for New Orleans, and now it's available everywhere. And I'm looking for new stories, more stories, and I just love to know what's going on and in the field and in the industry.
So you actually have a connection with Columbia, though, right? You had a fellowship there. What were you doing with that?
Yes, I'm a graduate of Columbia University. I have a master's degree in science, health, and environmental reporting. And then I also am an alum, or I also did a 2021-2022 Columbia Journalism Investigations Fellowship. And also last year was also a fellow. I was a recipient of Joan Connor Fellowship in the Journalism of Ideas program. My roots there go deep.
First off, I want to just ask you, what sort of people did you encounter that kind of stood out? What were some of the conversations that you had?
Again, it's my third conference, so I have an idea of what I'm looking for. And this particular time, I was really interested in the federal response to everything that's going on right now at FEMA, HUD, and also just about climate adaptation, specifically managed retreat. I have not seen a single person. I'm not sure. I know that people at FEMA were either discouraged or just not allowed to come. And to me, this was a loss, but also it was a symptom of the time. And also I was looking to connect and update my database and just learn things about other communities that are gearing up closer and closer to the decision to move. So yeah, those were my two goals. And I met wonderful people from Alaska. I've known them for a few years, but it was great to see Maurice Alexei from Nunapitchuk. It was great to see Max Neal from the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, researchers from Permafrost Pathways. I also was at the sessions about wildfires in California and wildfire-caused resettlement. So yeah, very interesting.
Did you gravitate toward presentations that you thought you could potentially do stories on, or were you just randomly selecting things?
I was not. Unfortunately, the way the conference is structured, you can only participate in as many sessions because they ran concurrently, right? So yes, pragmatically, I was looking into the things that I think I don't get enough knowledge about. Also, panels that I could potentially work with later for new stories. And also just, again, I've spent several years on one particular story, which on the one hand, spending so many years on one story is like an overkill, might seem like, but also the project was so encompassing and I looked at it from so many different angles, from the academic point of view, from the research, but also federal government, local government, state government, people who were subjected or who were like actually who needed to resettle and who eventually moved. It was a privilege to get like such a full picture and kind of understand how it works, not just like on the facts and figures, but also what's the energy behind it and where you should look for mistakes, because mistakes are inevitable in managed retreat. No one knows how to do it. So I like to be an observer, but also part of this growing movement of, I don't know, it's too big of a word to call me an expert, but to people who are deeply interested, who know what is involved and basically keep track on lessons learned from what's out there and what will happen tomorrow, because tomorrow we will have many more resettlements.
You're the only filmmaker that I'm interviewing for this episode, and I really find that interesting. And so as you're looking at these presentations and stuff, and you have a narrative eye around these things, did you feel like anything was especially cinematic, or you just, okay, your brain goes there?
There was one particular presentation, but by Noah Gottlieb. I think his project is called A Crumbling Land. He did a fantastic, and I think he's still working on this fantastic project, taking pictures, basically comparing historic images to what's out there right now with the communities that moved. I think that was amazing. Amazing. Guys, remember the name Noah Gottlieb and just check out. I think he's on Instagram, and also like you can find him online, Crumbling Land. It's a great visual project. And it's just like also when it tells the story that's so relevant, but also so visually and beautifully. It's art. He's a trained architect. So it's like, I mean, it's an experience and it's very rich visual experience.
Generally, managed retreat, and I keep calling it managed retreat, I can't stop it, just to manage relocation, but it brings together policymakers and planners and different leaders in the community. So do you notice any gaps or chances for richer storytelling through visual media? It's not something, there's a lot of academics at this conference, but do you see, what kind of gaps and chances do you see?
No, great question, which I'm not sure if there is a easy answer, right? Like I personally, first of all, to begin with managed retreat, I struggle with the term, right? And I also understand why this is the term that's being used. But I think the biggest gap is between the practitioners and the general public. I still believe people have no idea what's going on. That's my maybe subjective biased opinion. That's why like I'm trying to bring stories out there so that people understand that tomorrow it can be you or your neighbor. Yeah, there is this gap between academia and also policymakers and people. And that's not just the linguistic gap, but also the hard gap. It's I think as humans, we connect deeply to other people and people in need. I think I think we want to help and we want to connect, and most of us have empathy. But like when you just look at words, numbers, and dollar signs, it's hard, right? So I think storytelling, visual, like this is my medium, but also audio, like my podcast is a radio documentary. These are the ones that will bring the public closer to the understanding that we all need to get ready and adapt. Because again, according to the researchers, more than 13 million Americans will have to move by the end of this century, like less than 8 years.
So again, you're a filmmaker, you have these experiences, but what storytelling challenges emerge when you turn these complex subjects like climate change and managed retreat into human-focused media content? And one of the areas that I talk about when I give presentations is this notion of trying to explain, all right, in 2100, this is going to happen with sea level rise, or by 2075, you instantly lose people. And even great storytellers have trouble turning those future projections into something that's going to resonate today. And just curious your thoughts on that.
I agree with you completely. Like you start talking about, again, as I said, about numbers, about feet, and I mean flooding. I'm talking about flooding, how much like tidal surge, the feet of tidal surge, et cetera, or how much money goes into an adaptation project or resettlement project, and like policy, because these are policy heavy topics and people are gone because this is dry as toast. Again, I think it's maybe through individual experiences of people, of families, rich visuals or audio material, great writing, but also not just helicopter reporting where you do a short 1-paragraph news piece. And also, again, I respect my profession immensely. And I also know how much money and energy it takes to produce even like 1 paragraph. But I think there should be more funding for stories about managed retreat or people needing to move and the problems that arise from it. And I think we should, instead of thinking, in a way, again, like I've done investigative reporting, and there is a lot of who's culpable, what are the mistakes, what are the lessons learned. It follows this very, like, also almost scientific academic formula. There is a lot of use in this, especially for people who are making decisions, like for this, like, impact. But we all love good storytelling, and I think that should be at the core. And I think this storytelling or in public service should be at the core.
Well, I totally agree. They should give more funding to storytellers and media shops to have these stories. And so complete agreement. Last question for you is, if people want to learn more about your work, what do you recommend?
Thank you for asking that. Thank you so much. First of all, people who love podcasts, please check out my podcast. It's 3 episodes, so it's doable over like a car ride or when you do your laundry or somewhere else. 3 episodes. It's called Leaving the Island. It's on all podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple, you name it. Then that's for the latest on the climate resettlement stories. Otherwise, I have a website, www.olga-loginova.com. If you know my name, I'm easy to find, and my work is pretty easy to find.
All right, Olga, I will have links in my show notes to all those things so they don't have to worry about writing that down or anything. But Olga, I appreciate what you're doing. We need more storytellers out there. You've done some incredible work, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Hey, Adapters, joining me is Rob Moore. Rob is the Director, Climate Adaptation at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Hi, Rob. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Doug. Great to be here.
As a handful of people, you are a regular on this podcast. It's always a treat to have you. We were at the MR2025 conference together, and I want to bring you on afterwards to have this conversation. But first, for those people who don't know who you are, what do you do there at NRDC?
I work on a lot of issues dealing with climate adaptation, particularly around flooding and sea level rise. Although now I'm shifting a bit more of my work to things that states can do to reduce their risks, and also address some of the growing crises we see around the country in private insurance and housing markets.
So what brought you to this conference?
I've been really interested in the whole notion of managed retreat and how do we better meet people's needs when they see that they can't continue to live safely where they live today and have chosen to live there really due to no fault of their own, right? They may not have understood the risks. They may have lived in a state that doesn't have policies that would require them to be informed about the risks when they decide to either rent or buy a home. And now they know what the risks are all too well, and they want to get out. And it can be a real process for people to get that type of assistance here in the United States and elsewhere. So I think the Columbia Conference is a great place where people who are studying these problems and working on these issues from a variety of perspectives can come together and share some of what they know and some of the ideas they have for how we can provide this assistance to people, because it's a problem that's only getting larger by leaps and bounds. And more hazards are causing different types of displacements beyond just flooding and sea level rise.
So you moderated a panel there. Can you just briefly give us an overview? What were you trying to accomplish with that?
Yeah, the panel I helped organize was around the issue of public trust doctrine in an era of climate change. And for listeners that aren't aware of what public trust doctrine is, essentially there are certain lands in every state where the state has decided they are always going to be held in the public trust, and they are essentially the responsibility of the state to be stewards for. These are typically lands that are coastal or riverine or tidally influenced. So they're often lands that are submerged for all or part of the time. This becomes a big concern in the era of sea level rise because most states define the public trust lands by the average high tide. What is the average high tide when the tide is getting higher every single year? That line is now not something that stays in generally the same place. It's now moving landward each and every year, which means private properties, private homes eventually are going to be on public property. What happens in that circumstance? We've seen around the country homes falling into the ocean. That's not what should happen. Right? There should be a little more deliberate plan for dealing with these. So anyway, this panel was about how can we proactively use public trust doctrine to make better decisions about where we build and how we build, especially in coastal areas. And then how do we deal with these inevitable situations where private homes suddenly find themselves on public lands?
I'm thinking NRDC, and if bear with me with this question here. So if we were in normal times with a functioning federal government and in regards to climate change and thinking about these issues, and I think about the federal agencies of FEMA and HUD, so are they structured in normal times to support proactive retreat, or are they still reactive in what they do? And are there any things that you would change? And again, we need to park the sort of unusual things that are happening right now, obviously very negative things.
Yeah, I think FEMA and HUD have struggled to do these things proactively. It's somewhat outside of how to say this? Almost by definition, they are forced to deal with these in a more reactive manner. HUD and FEMA aren't going to just arrive in your community and say, we need to get you folks out of here. We have a plan. Here's what we propose. Let's talk about it. They have to wait for a local government or a state to come to them and say, hey, we've got a problem. We'd like to talk to you about how we might be able to get a grant, or we'd like your advice on how to do this. So it's not something that the federal government is well set up to do, even in the best of times. And right now is not the best of times.
And again, understatement right there. A lot of the thing that at this conference work is it's kind of hypothetical, even though I think there are some really interesting on the ground case studies that are things that are happening now. But I don't know if you were thinking as you're watching a presentation, I do this a lot, is what do you think successful retreat would look like? You know, how, and of course you can't go into too many details, but what do you think that would look like?
Oh, don't you have any hard questions to ask?
Just the ideal world, what would it look like? I guess what I'm asking you.
I think in an ideal world, communities would be making decisions with the future fully in mind, right? You would be, before you issued a building permit, before you allowed a developer to put something up, before you sited your sewage treatment plant, you would think, hey, this thing's going to be here a long time. What's the world going to look like 70 years from now? Is this the right place to put this, given what we know the world will look like in 5, 6, 7 decades? Is this the way we should build this? So I think that's missing from most of our decision-making processes at every level of government. And then I think if you were going to be doing managed retreat, communities would actually have to not only think about what we're building and where we're building it today, but also, hey, there's places we really need to actually unbuild. It doesn't have to be done this year. It doesn't even have to be completed within the next 5 to 10 years. but it needs to be part of something that we are chipping away at each and every year, helping people who see the problems and are living with the problems, getting them the assistance to relocate to somewhere safer when the next storm comes in, have built the capacity, learned the lessons about how to do these things well so that you can help the next group of people who realize they need to relocate. There's just a lot of things that need to happen on a regular basis in order for managed retreat, I think, to move from being simply a theory that we talk about to being something we actually put into practice.
Following up on that thought, I think about all the academics that have put a lot of intellectual energy around this issue, and policy people like you too, but you don't hear about it out in the public very often. There's been some communities like in New Jersey where they're like a very targeted, but they don't even talk it more broadly like managed retreat. And I know they're trying to even get away from that term, but who do you think ideally would be like a good spokesman for this? And I'm thinking like maybe a mayor or maybe more sort of a public person. At some point, people need to start talking about this more broadly, and it can't just be academics talking to themselves. Who do you think would just be an ideal spokesperson to dealing with this very complicated topic?
Yeah, another nice softball question from you, Doug. Really appreciate it. I like to joke sometimes that managed retreat is like the weather. Everybody talks about it. Nobody's doing anything about it. To really do managed retreat requires an extraordinary amount of planning, foresight, and commitment. This isn't something you dip your toes into. And I think here in the United States, we're in the dip your toes into it moment. Really, we're not really talking about doing managed retreat anywhere except in a very few isolated instances. That's probably the closest we're getting right now to something that looks like managed retreat, is helping buy out private properties and enable people to move from high risk areas, hopefully to lower risk areas. And even that is proving to be extremely difficult for many reasons. There's a whole host of things that complicate the process of even delivering that assistance, even at a small level.
What stood out at the conference for you? There was a lot of material there.
I've always appreciated the work that Jesse Keenan does. He gave a wonderful and thought-provoking plenary session on the last day of the conference. I think one of the things I find refreshing about Jesse's work is that he tends to look at these things with a pretty pragmatic and clear-eyed view. A lot of times I think we get hung up on the idealized situation and how things should look if everything could line up correctly. And I think one of the things I find refreshing about Jesse's observations and his writings and his scholarship is that he recognizes the difficulties involved and that there's going to be trade-offs in everything we do, unfortunately.
Rob, always a treat to have you on, and it was great seeing you in person, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Likewise, Doug. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, Adapters, joining me is Kelly Main. Kelly is the founder and executive director of Buy-In Community Planning. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk a bit about the conference and the work that you were doing there, but tell us a bit about Buy-In Community Planning. Who are you guys?
Yeah, so Buy-In Community Planning is a national 501c3 or nonprofit organization, and we're really dedicated to helping communities design and implement voluntary home buyout programs, voluntary assisted relocation programs, however you want to call it. We're really in the weeds with our national partners trying to figure out how to make this happen. And we really do that through two pillars. The first is what I have grown to call our Community Partnerships Program. We're primarily working with other community-based organizations around the country that are members of the Anthropocene Alliance, which is a national coalition of frontline environmental and climate justice groups. And we use grant funding to partner with these organizations to co-design and implement household-level surveys in flood-affected areas, or also in places exposed to a lot of environmental hazards related to industrial pollution and really the nexus of flooding and pollution. And we conduct these surveys and then aggregate the data into a community advocacy report, which our partners can use to better understand what is the level of interest in relocation, what are the types of negative health impacts, both mental health like stress and anxiety, but also respiratory illness and exposure to things like mold and pollution in the soil. And they can use this report to go to their local government and say, hey, folks in this community are being affected by flooding, and they see a buyout as a potential solution for them to start over in a safer location and really rebuild their lives. And the second part is that in the case that the local government is interested or willing to respond to the requests of the community, we will work with them to apply for and administer federal grants for buyouts like the programs through FEMA or HUD. We've had some success with that program. We had 4 HMGP buyouts with our partners in Missouri last year. Unfortunately, a lot of our buyouts were canceled through BRIC. This year, with the lack of federal funding, we're really working with our partners to look for other types of funding options, financing solutions. And we also do fee-for-service consulting with states and cities and other organizations as a subject matter expert on the topic of buyouts and managed retreat. And so I'm really excited to see this increase in calls for proposals and RFPs to really mainstream this topic of relocation or buyouts into state planning, local planning, and really make it a feasible option for the households that we serve that want to move.
You're working with community-based organizations across the country. So specifically, what are you hearing from residents about relocation? Who's really interested, and what do they need to really make it work?
Yeah, so in most of the communities that we've surveyed, interest in relocation is fairly high. It's actually higher than you might expect. Our survey data is showing that in a lot of the communities we're surveying, it's about 50% of people that are ready to move, that have stated on the survey, I'm interested in a buyout and I am ready to move. It means that they were ready to move weeks ago or months ago or maybe even years ago. But we also give people the option to say, I'm interested in a buyout, but I'm just not ready to commit at this time. And that'll range to basically another 5 to 20% of the survey results. Of course, this varies community to community, but we're finding that the survey data actually challenges the narrative that people who live in harm's way in difficult situations really want to stay in place and build resilience in place. Of course, there are people who want to do that, but what our survey data is revealing is that maybe we should be spending as much time and attention on making relocation a viable option for people as we are on building resilience in place based off of the demands of local residents. The other things that we're finding from our survey data is that really microeconomic factors, the amount of money that people are offered, having a stable and affordable place to live, the actually most important thing that folks say is that the health and safety of themselves and their family is the primary motivator for their decision on whether or not to take a buyout. And so in these really high-risk places, people are seeing relocation as a way to improve the health and security of their families. But usually they're constrained by economic decisions. Folks that we're working with live in parts of their community that have lower property values because of known flood risk or proximity to pollution. And the fair market value process that a buyout offers them is not necessarily going to be a viable solution without additional support. And so our survey data is reinforcing what some of the academic studies about, constraints from or economic constraints due to the fair market value appraisal process. It's reinforcing that, but it's also challenging. It's still the last thing that I'll say on this is it's challenging the narrative that connections to place and place attachment are the primary factors motivating people who want to stay or want to go. I just want to emphasize again that it's not that doesn't matter in any community, but in most of the we're working with, place attachment is not a significant decision-making factor in people's decision to move.
In your presentation, you talked about Pascagoula, Mississippi, and what's happening there and what lessons do you think could be more broadly applied from what's happening there?
Yeah, so this is a really exciting project. We've been partnering with a community-based organization called Cherokee Concerned Citizens since the spring of 2022. And we conducted a household survey there with our partners to try to better understand the perspective on relocation and get that really granular level of detail, because Cherokee Concerned Citizens as an organization has been fighting for an industrial pollution-related buyout in their community for over a decade. And this is coming both from a lot of pretty well-documented cancer rates, respiratory illness, negative health impacts this community had, a lot of industrial material and effluent enter their homes during Hurricane Katrina. They're essentially located right across the bayou from a very large Chevron refinery. They have Rolls-Royce and Bollinger and a lot of other, industries that are critical to workforce and economic development in Pascagoula, but are really dangerous to live right next to. And so what this project is trying to do is combine the buyout or the relocation interest of residents into a restoration zone, an opportunity to recreate a blue-green buffer in eastern Pascagoula that protects residents on the western side of Pascagoula to the west and the north, that creates public amenities and access points, that restores a riparian floodplain and wetland ecosystem. And this is really the kind of core idea behind Buy-in's mission, which is to bring people together to talk about the benefits that relocation can provide, not just relocation can provide for people who are seeking the opportunity to move, but how relocation can really reveal these new opportunities in a community for resilience building, for ecosystem restoration. And in the case of cities like Pascagoula that have really high flood insurance rates, potentially even help lower flood insurance premiums through community rating system points. How do we get people to come together and see selected and targeted relocation projects as something that is really potentially beneficial for resilience building as a whole?
We're recording this after the actual conference, but can you share some of the highlights from MR 2025 for you?
Sure. Yeah. In addition to our community partnerships program work, it's been really exciting to see an increase in, I'd say, state level programs, especially with the lack of federal support right now, or let's say the devolution of responsibility of management to the states. It's really great to see a couple of states coming forward, leading the way on developing their own acquisition funds or programs specifically related to resilience building in the coastal zone that includes retreat as opposed to just shoreline options. New York State has a new program called Blue Buffers, which they're launching. And through the Environmental Bond Act, there's a request for proposals out at the state of Massachusetts. And I was born in Hawaii, and I was really enjoying returning to the Hawaii session. There was a team working on, they're calling like a beach resilience planning strategy for addressing coastal erosion in Hawaii. And it was really cool to see the consultant team, including traditional indigenous teachings, cultural practices, traditional ecological knowledge into their frameworks for talking about retreat as really something about protecting our coastlines, protecting public access to the beach, thinking through both public trust, but also cultural traditions and things related to the beach as a way of processing the very real impacts of erosion in Hawaii. And I always enjoy the Hawaii sessions, and they're doing really great progressive work that I think the rest of the country can definitely learn from.
All right. Thanks, Kelly, for coming on the podcast for the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, Adapters, join me is Macy Williams. Macy is the Resilience Manager at the Center for Planning Excellence. Hi, Macy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
First off, can you just tell us what the center's all about? What do you guys do there?
Absolutely. So the Center for Planning Excellence, also known as CPEX, is a nonprofit planning and policy organization that serves the entire state of Louisiana. Our work spans from supporting communities through technical assistance in a variety of capacities, all the way to leading master comprehensive planning efforts for all different sizes of communities throughout Louisiana. And we also work with state level government to advance policies that serve a more long-term sustainable planning practices that we support.
We're going to talk a bit about the conference, but first, I always like to just get a little bit of background on folks. How you're doing climate migration. How did you get into this space?
It's a great question. And before I got into it, before I presented at the conference, I was thinking about this myself. And I think that it goes back to moving to Louisiana as a 14-year-old. I moved here, didn't really have any family here except for one parent and a sister, and realized very shortly after moving here that this was very different from anywhere I've ever lived before. And I had always aimed to leave Louisiana. Once I got here at 14, started high school, stayed here because the state has a scholarship program for students that do well in high school where they pay for your undergraduate degree. So I did that. And then COVID hit whenever I was going to graduate. So I stayed here a bit longer. And so leaving took a lot longer than I ever anticipated. And when I finally left, I realized that I actually love this place and that my heart and passion is at the nexus of my desire to work in climate migration. People are only who they're connected with and who they invest in and where they're doing that at. And so climate migration, given where we're at environmentally, it's at the core of all of this. And so I don't see a way in living in this world without working in this space.
All right, fantastic. So you presented at MR2025, and I actually saw your presentation. What were you trying to accomplish with that presentation?
I was a part of the Receiving Communities in U.S. panel, and alongside my panelists, we presented our research that was focused on just highlighting different communities in the U.S. and different challenges or considerations that need to be influencing decision-making around this topic here. And my presentation was really trying to take my research, but nestling that within this larger picture idea, which is how CPEX operates. And that is leaning into your systems and the decision makers in your community, recognizing what you bring to the table and making connections with the people that are actually getting things done. So that is really what I hoped to drive home in my presentation, all while highlighting what Louisiana is going through with land loss and how my research fits into that, highlighting the infrastructural needs as we're thinking about prioritizing funding to support efforts such as this.
When people hear the climate migration, they often think international borders, people moving between countries, but most of that movement is actually internal. I think that's a message that you were trying to say. And so why is that such an important distinction when you're thinking about the United States and the cities in the U.S.?
While I'd love to address the U.S. entirely here, I think that the reality of all of this is that everything needs to be and should be hyper community focused. And so I'll refrain from addressing the U.S., and I'll bring it down to Louisiana's context. The reality is that when people are moving away from an area, that community that they're leaving, and especially when you think about, or if there's an acute reason like a hurricane or a slow onset reason like sea level rise, there are different considerations here. But an overarching consideration is that when you lose people, you lose tax base, you lose money. You lose support, you're losing businesses, you're losing livelihood, you're losing quality of life. People are really at the backbone of everything that makes a community. And so if there isn't strategic planning for the inevitable, which is the movement of people, I mean, that is what has hallmarked the Homo sapien journey. If there isn't strategic planning for things like this, then people will move across community lines into different parishes or counties if you're outside of Louisiana or they'll move across state lines. And usually when people leave, they don't come back. So there's a lot to grapple with there, but I'll leave it at that.
In your actual presentation, you shared a framework for what makes a good receiving community. So the flip side of that. And so what does that really look like in practice?
What I presented on was the need to consider your more physical infrastructure in your receiving communities. There is a big research gap here, and my research only hits on one aspect of this, which is the stormwater management infrastructure. And at places like Louisiana, this is really an important aspect of the physical infrastructure in receiving communities, because the reality is that a lot of these systems and many of the communities that people will be moving to is very antiquated. And already to this day, with the existing demand on the system, is they're struggling to meet the needs of the people that are using said systems. And so what we're finding is that there's a lot of flooding and unnecessarily. And so what's happening now, whenever you think about, and so with climate change, we know that not only are people going to be moving, but also we're going to have increases and overall just changes to what we're experiencing today. And so if our investment doesn't reflect the changes in these very important variables, we are only going to perpetuate existing challenges and challenges we are yet to foresee.
But you were there at the conference and there were a lot of great presentations. What were some of the highlights at the conference for you?
Oh, such a great question. It was such an amazing opportunity to be surrounded by and learning from so many great minds and people leading in this field. But I think something that really stuck with me was from the insurance panel and listening to Andronika Morris, who is the executive director of the Housing NOLA group. She really substantiated and made digestible the insurance crisis that is at the nexus of a lot of challenges that many of us are experiencing in Louisiana and beyond. And so that was a really great presentation. Another thing that really stuck with me was the way in which many of these professionals are thinking about creatively communicating all the different facets that come along with mobility and resilience. So I think that was really endearing and very empowering and very inspiring, was being around so many people who are thinking about how to communicate on these very large, challenging topics.
If people want to learn more about your work and your organization's work, what do you recommend?
Please go to www.cpex.org. There's lots to learn from there, a ton of open source resources for communities that are looking to explore resilient and adaptive measures.
Hey, Adapters. Join me is Dr. Jesse Keenan. Jesse is a Favreau Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning and the Director of the Center on Climate Change and Urbanism within the faculty of the School of Architecture at Tulane University. Hi, Jesse. Welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, Jesse, listen, I haven't even kept track. You obviously have been on the most of this podcast. People know you. I hear about you all the time from my listeners, so it's always a pleasure. But I have you back on because we went to this conference together, and you're the wrap-up conversation that I'm doing. First off, let's talk about, you've been involved with this conference since the very beginning. How has it evolved up to this MR2025?
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because in many ways, the origins of this conference are, I don't know, I think it's interesting. A lot of it was a bunch of people at Columbia, including myself, who were gearing up a climate adaptation work and really trying to push applied work at the university to take on more adaptation because we saw the huge sort of analytical robustness of the existing faculties and research capacities there. And so all of a sudden, Hurricane Sandy hits. Hurricane Sandy really hits home the idea of the kind of human dimensions, of the idea of human mobility in general, the fact that people are just leaving some places and going to other places. And it really just grounded our orientation to a whole new set of challenges and problems that were messy in a way, but also very real, in many ways inspirational. From that very origin of something happening in our backyard to open our eyes to a whole new frame of thinking, to a conference today, which pulls in people from all across the country and really all across the world who have found similar points of inspiration and or maybe similar points of inspiration, but have diversified a huge range of research and practices too. And this is the interesting about this conference. It started out as research and it ends up with an enormous amount of practice. And over time, we've had policymakers, we've had lawyers, engineers, a wide variety of people involved and engaged. So it's not just researchers. And in that sense, it does feel grounded and in the moment in ways that sometimes academic conferences get bogged down by the ambition, the empirical ambition or the conceptual facility with jargon that maybe isn't so useful sometimes.
You've written extensively about the intersection of real estate markets and climate risks. So how do you see managed retreat fitting into those economic dynamics?
I'm not sure if I've written extensively. I might have just had maybe first mover advantage in thinking about it. For me, and we've seen this in the work of people throughout the conference, is that it's not just the first order impacts that are displacing people. In fact, there's a bunch of cohorts out there that it isn't just about being displaced. There's people who are stress-based agents. They're responding in economic decision-making. There's people who are circumstantial opportunists who see an opportunity relative to climate risk and amenitization, and they move or make investments in one way or the other. And even among other groups, there's people really far out who are long-term opportunists who are making strategic investments in receiving zones. So it's not just people being displaced. There's all different levels of behavior and agency among different types of people and cohorts throughout the world, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States. If it's not just about displacement and the kind of deterministic role that climate impacts play in pushing people, we know that migration behavior, relocation behavior is very complex. It's very rarely a kind of singular function of losing your house and then you move, although that happens sometimes. We're starting to see in that complexity that economics plays a big role in driving chronic stresses and costs and driving cost burdens that are interacting with a slew of climatic and non-climatic attributed phenomenon. So in that sense, we have an affordability housing crisis. We have all of these other stresses that exist. And climate and the cost and the second order effects and input of market-driven adaptations sometimes themselves, but more broadly distributed losses in a way, are reshaping household economies and reshaping household behavior, but also economic behavior more broadly. The economy is playing a role in adapting, and we see many agents and sectors and companies that are adapting, and there's good and bad things about that. It may be maladaptive to others, but we have, I think, with greater clarity, an idea that these various economic agents, through the conduits of housing and insurance and all these other things, are playing a very important role. And there's a lot of people at this conference that take that on and try to give some resolution to what that looks like today and maybe what it might look like tomorrow. And that, for me, I think that's super interesting and is on the frontier of where adaptation could or should be.
So in your view, what's the biggest policy lever we're not pulling when it comes to managed retreat in the U.S.? We know what's going on at the federal level, but there's things that I guess could be happening at state and local level.
I think that the biggest lever that we're not pulling or pushing, depending on how you look at it, is land use and zoning. We've had so much focus on engineering performance standards and building codes. And those things matter and they de-risk some portion of our built environment. But really at scale, particularly when we're trying to balance very complex interactions between social and environmental welfare and quality, land use and zoning are by far the most effective at scale mechanisms that we have. And perhaps even the most defensible in terms of the localized nature of the politics that drive those decisions. And of course, that stands as a barrier, but it's also an opportunity for, let's say, democratic processes to decide who gets to move forward and who gets left behind, which is what I think a lot of people assume is going to happen. Of course, going back to the previous question, we assume it's democracy that's going to push us forward and making these determinations of winners and losers, but really it's the market economy in many ways that's shaping our options and the paths forward. And that's in contradiction to our ideas of the way democratic governance works in
relation to investing in adaptation or pushing adaptation processes forward. But to your question, it's land use and zoning. And I think I could finish the rest of my career just taking on that topic, actually.
What moments or kind of themes came out of MR 2025 that stood out most for you? And was there signs of optimism for you, or were there red flags that stood out more?
I think there's a lot of optimism in just seeing how many people came from South Asia in particular, from Africa. People really came from everywhere. And this felt more international now than ever. And wow, what a time to come to the United States, or what a terrible time to come to the United States as a climate researcher or practitioner. It's got to be scary. Who wants to go through customs or whatever going through? People sacrificed a lot to come to this, but they also brought a lot. And I think what they brought is a kind of optimism that these things are moving forward globally and we can learn from this or not. And to me, that's a huge moment of optimism, because sometimes we get bogged down in our own mess in our own backyard and we forget that things may not look great around the world, but we do see progress, at least in these terms. Yeah, I feel pretty good about that. And for me, highlight certainly Presidente Carlos Alvarado starting things off with a kind of philosophy of what it takes to build coalitions and what it takes to communicate these things. Because as you've championed for many years and others, your success politically, and all of this is politics, by the way, is often defined by how you frame the winners and the losers, what's at stake, what you're really doing. And a lot of times, particularly with the disproportionate amount of, let's say, lefty, liberal progressives, I'd like to think we're all liberal in a way, but not in political terms, but in philosophical terms. But the disproportionate sort of progressive agenda, particularly social justice agenda, I think sometimes clouds our perspective with a somewhat predetermined range of beneficiaries that is exclusive in many ways in terms, certainly not entirely representative of the communities that really are in the process of relocation or migration. And that's fine. They're part of their own special interest groups in that regard. But I think broadening her horizons is part about how we shape the communications, and the communications themselves force us to rethink some of our assumptions about who's really participating or not, or should be participating in all of these adaptation processes. So it's like you can't overlook the politics, but also the communication components of all of this.
All right, Jesse, you gave a fantastic keynote to wrap up the conference. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to all the experts who participated in this episode. One thing that stuck with me throughout these conversations is just how far ahead the experts are compared to the public conversation. Managed retreat, whether we call it mobility, relocation, or something else, is still politically sensitive and emotionally heavy, but it's already underway and it's accelerating. What's missing is a broader audience. We can't expect smart, just, and humane decisions if this conversation stays confined to planners and academics. We need storytellers, journalists, community leaders, and yes, podcasts bringing this issue to the public square. That doesn't mean scaring people, but it does mean treating this with the urgency it deserves. Because the longer we wait, the fewer choices we'll have. Huge thanks to the MR 2025 organizers for hosting me. This conference was packed with thoughtful sessions, powerful speakers, and a real sense of purpose. Definitely check out the show notes to learn more about what the agenda was all about. The Columbia Climate School provided an incredible setting for these tough but necessary conversations. And what a treat to interview President Alvarado, a first for this podcast. And thanks again to Tulane University's Center on Climate Change and Urbanism for sponsoring this episode. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.